Welcome, Mariano Pensotti.
Thank you so much. Prost. Salud.
Salud. Thank you very much for this lovely premiere last evening. How are you today?
I have this relief feeling, I guess. I have to admit that it felt extremely special, you know, after the pandemics and after a couple of years without the chance to present our work in front of a live audience. I mean, it might sound a bit cheesy, but it was extremely moving and special last night. Yeah.
I heard your happy screamings from the backstage when I was passing through. I thought that was nice. It sounded like a bunch of teenagers.
We were indeed as a bunch of teenagers. Yeah. But it's true, you know, I think probably it was this sort of bottled-up tension because there was so much uncertainty in the last months. And to be honest, we were afraid all the time that probably there will be new regulations that we will block us to come here. We were very much afraid about the situation in Argentina because of the pandemic. So I think everything came together yesterday, you know. And
so what would you say, for how long did you have to sort of keep up the balloon in the air? For how long did you have to keep up the energy until yesterday?
Well, you know, it was a process in different steps. Because we started with the project like probably 2 years ago, and then we kept on changing it. Also because during the pandemic, at a certain point, I felt that it didn't make that much sense, the original piece that I wrote, because from the beginning I knew that it was going to dealing with the idea of the present and the future. And then suddenly during the pandemic, you know, the whole idea of future, it started to change for all of us. So I felt compelled to include somehow a different idea of future and a different idea of present as well. So in that sense, we had to keep that energy of the piece evolving in a more conceptual or theoretical way during some time. And then the rehearsals itself, they started like 3 months ago in Buenos Aires. But it was quite different because we were rehearsing with no set or anything. And also in Buenos Aires, we were not allowed actually to rehearse in a theater because of the pandemic as well. So it was a sort of let's say, a sort of illegal rehearsals that we had to make, and that, you know, took us to that level where we had to, yes, maintain this energy until yesterday in a very particular way.
Mm. Now, one of the most important aspects of the play, as I saw it, is the factor of time, and I think we can all say that time is something very demanding and seems to be one of the biggest challenges that we have, because we cannot conquer time, we cannot stop time, we cannot change the past. We can, as we see now, not really totally influence the future, and our presence seems to be totally eaten up by the pandemic. So what would you say, how can we deal with time in a phase of time where we find ourselves in a state of catastrophe?
That's a fantastic question. During many time I was dealing in my artistic practice with the idea of past mostly, you know, and the idea of how much we can somehow change past every time that we retell it, and how much we are all inventing our own narrative, not just, you know, as an individuals, but also as societies. And this is probably the very first time that I'm mostly focusing on the idea of future, of what are we going to become, and also trying to make a sort of a small comparison about the personal lives and some sort of utopias, you know, that in the piece there are mentions to not clear utopias, but there are mentions to these buildings in Buenos Aires who are a replica of buildings in Europe, which at the time seems as a sort of utopia, you know, like building a Paris in South America. That was the narrative that the people built at the time there. And then this very rough neighborhood where the poor kid that the documentary is following, it was also a sort of utopic city during the 60s in Buenos Aires, like a utopian that it went completely wrong. So I felt that this idea of failed societies somehow it's something that resemble to you know, the changes that you experience through life and how different you are at the end of what you imagine at the beginning that you will become. Of course, the whole idea of future, I didn't want it to go in an extremely pretentious way of talking about the future. You know, it's after all the theater piece and not a sociological treaty or something like that. But still, I just wanted to address the concept of future and how much we can invent the future through fiction. It might sound a bit naive, but yeah, I think one of the first steps after the pandemic was like that, to start imagining again what the future could look like, even if it's not like a bright future, the one that we are imagining.
But I think the arts may be the only tools, so to say, that we have to do that. We have always dealt with portraying the future. There's a huge literary movement called what we call science fiction that only concentrates on this. So also your set design shows something that is actually impossible, because it shows like two phases of time close to each other and at the same time. So what would you say, how important are the arts in these days? Because we hear like very opposite things. One group of people, they say, we have been so hungry, we have been starving, everything was closed, we want to go to the theater, to concerts, to everything, we want to join that. And there's also other groups of people who say, well, it went quite well through the pandemic. We were just sitting on the sofa and watching all kinds of movies and videos and streamings and whatsoever. So it's not really necessary anymore. What do you think? How important are the arts concerning this life moment, this physical moment, where we really see two stages that build one stage, and we see like the present and the past and the future? How much important is that?
I really believe that art can raise or put on the table some questions that no other fields can make. Again, I think that what we are trying to make with the pieces, you know, like to open some windows and to yeah, start to think about the future in a way that is not the one that can make the politics or the sociology or any other field. So that's why I feel art is so fundamental right now. Also because the reflection or the invention, actually not really the reflection, but more the invention that we can make of the present, it's completely different than from other forms of expression. And that's also why, going back to your question, why it was also so important for us to have both times together, you know, because the idea of having the present and the future together and the audience experiencing both things at a time, we believe that it creates like a sort of a third image, you know, it's like montage in cinema when you have two images and then suddenly like a sort of a third one appears on the mind of the spectator. So that's why this idea of having the present and the future at a time, we believe that it creates a sort of in-between that makes, you know, appear some reflections of, okay, what's my present look like, or how I am going to be in 30 years from now. And then you mentioned before the idea of how much also art itself pretends to preserve time, to catch experience. And I think that was also something that it was around there during the creative process. And that's also why we decided to include this documentary film about the boy in Buenos Aires. Also because we wanted to create a sort of contrast in between the ephemeral medium of theater and the cinema, which pretends to preserve experience, to catch time. So for a piece that deals with the idea of time and time passing by, it was interesting for us to have both mediums together.
Mm-hmm. I like the expression of the invention, because normally we use invention more in a scientific space, that scientists invent things. I think it's very important to discuss that idea specifically also with young people, because from what I know when I talk to very young people, that they sometimes don't really have a perspective of inventing something, because we seem to give them the impression that everything has been invented, and now we find ourselves in a phase of time where we try to correct what we have invented. So how can we encourage young people all over the world to be inventive and to still believe in the power of invention, specifically in the arts, and the power of transformation? How can we do that? Because I think I'm 58 now, and I think what would I do if I was 20? And I would look around and say everything has been invented, and now mankind is just trying to correct all the flaws, you know. So what can we do with the arts to encourage them and give them the feeling of being inventive themselves?
Absolutely, yeah. I believe that's something very important, because it's also, I mean, contemporary world is like full so much of information and images that it might be pretty easy to get the feeling that everything is done and things are like that you cannot really invent something new or to change them in a radical way. Perhaps one of the only positive sides of the recent pandemic times is that they are a little bit like a sort of a tabula rasa suddenly, and I had the feeling that probably for young people it might feel like, well, we have the possibility to create or invent things from the scratch, you know, specifically from the art field, because, well, you had to create new mediums or new forms to, you know, get related with the other, or new forms of associations. It was very interesting in Buenos Aires that during the pandemic everything was closed and theaters were closed for a year and a half. So we had to invent new forms and new ways to associate with other artists and to try to keep on creating things, even if we didn't know where those things were going to be shown or what for exactly. But I'm really quite optimistic in a way that those experiences are going to be the seeds and the starting point of new things. And also in a more broader sense, I also have the impression that capitalism has been very successful in selling the world the idea that there's no other way to arrange a society rather than capitalism. And probably, well, of course, I don't really agree with that. And probably these times are also a good opportunity to start to examine again, or questioning ourselves, is this the only way to arrange a society or the relationship with the others and, you know, working relationships? Or there might be a possibility to invent other ways.
I have a very naive question, but I'm totally interested in that. Would you say that probably people in South America, or specifically people in Argentina, or even more specifically people in Buenos Aires, have a different feeling of time than people have, for instance, in cities of Europe, because you tour a lot through Europe, so you have the possibility to compare. Would you say that there's a totally different sense of time?
that's not a naive question at all. It makes me think. Indeed, yes. I think I don't really have a conceptualization about it, but it's true that if I think about it, yes. I don't know exactly how much that is going to change because of the current condition of the world. But yes, indeed, I always have the feeling that probably in Europe the sense of time is more linear, and the perception is that the idea of future is more take it for granted or more secure, while in the specific context of Argentina and the specific context of Buenos Aires, because of our constant economic and social crisis, the idea of future and the perception of time, it's more like a sort of electrocardiogram, because sometimes you have this feeling that the time speeds up and it's extremely accelerated and then suddenly it stops. And of course, the idea of future and what are you going to become in the future, it's probably very different. I mean, in a personal level, I was very, I mean, for me, it was absolutely normal that my parents were having like 4 different jobs in order to get enough money to pay the bills, and that's absolutely normal for every person in Buenos Aires. And I'm talking about the middle class, not the working class or the excluded. So the idea of time and running from one place to another, and that you don't really know exactly what is going to happen with you during the next 2 years, probably gives you a particularly very different perception of time. And now that I think about it, it's probably also, it has, I mean, besides some political agenda, the idea of building buildings in Buenos Aires, which are replicas of some European ones. Of course, it was an idea of reshape this new country as a sort of distorted mirror of Europe, but also a way to, you know, preserve time that it was different in another place. You know, it's an idea of representation and probably feel more secure about something that it was more blurred.
It sounds a bit, what you say sounds a bit like as if the people, for instance, in Buenos Aires, are more oriented towards all sorts of improvisation.
Absolutely.
Which is, of course, very interesting for arts, that you have to improvise. Because if you have a full concept and you sort of write it on your kitchen table, then you come to the rehearsing space or to the concert hall or wherever, and you just do it. It's boring. So it's very interesting what you say, because I come from a country, Switzerland, where there's almost no improvisation. And I think at the same time Switzerland is moving towards a point where there will be improvisation, even if it comes through nature. Because if you go for a hike up in the Alps and you look at the glaciers, and I know how they looked like 40 years ago, even 50 years ago, and when I look at them now, they are almost gone. So I think that's a weird thing, to come from a country where you see something coming up, really seriously coming up, but the whole country seems to be like a sleeping beauty, you know. And I had an excellent job there. I could run a wonderful theater for 10 years, but now and then I had these feelings of horror, because I felt, I felt it was so surreal. Nothing is real there, because there's a lot of luxury and stability and everything, but there's a huge fear of improvising. And I thought, when I saw the show yesterday, I thought, even from the tonality, how people speak on stage, you can somehow see this constant musicality of let's go there, let's do that. So there's this very vivid thing also in the language, and I thought that's very interesting for a German-speaking audience, because now and then I was asking myself, what would happen if they would speak German? If it would be a German director, if the language was German and everything would take place in Germany. And that was interesting, because I thought it would not be really interesting. So the specific warmth of all that seems to really come from a different angle of the world, which has a different angle of view, and that is what I liked very much, because this improvisation character was totally in it as an important musicality. Is that right, or is that just
That's absolutely right? No, it's absolutely right. You know, one of the tricky things, it's true that, theater in Argentina, it was originally very based in improvisation, and it's still very much also because probably society, it's very much built on improvisation. You know, we don't really have a plan about how it's going to be things in the next 10 years. Nobody knows, and even the politicians don't really care about this sort of planning. So yeah, you have this sense of everything has to be immediate, and you have to be ready to improvise and to move yourself and to adapt to new situations in a very fast way. And then it's true that we speak a way of Spanish in a very fast way. We have a strong Italian influence because we have a huge immigration of Italians during the beginning of the 20th century. So the way we speak, it's extremely fast. And I have to say that I'm always worried when I have to present a piece in front of international audience, because I know how demanding it is to follow with subtitles what we are saying. Am I trying to remind all the time to the performers that, well, we have to, you know, adapt a little bit to that. And then, yeah, you know, going back to Switzerland, I have a funny story, because part of my family went from Switzerland to Argentina. Actually, I have a
Swiss passport. I heard it.
I have a Swiss passport, which I always feel so fake when using it, you know, but it's true, because I mean, my grandfather, the father of my mother, he was from Switzerland, and you sort of inherit the citizenship. So I'm also Swiss, and also my daughters, and our real connection with Switzerland is minimum. But during we have a huge economic crisis and social and political crisis in 2001. I mean, we had several of those, but 2001 was extremely terrible, and people were fleeing and leaving the country. So I was very young at the time, so I thought, okay, let's go to Switzerland, you know, since I have the right to go there and stay there. And I went there with my girlfriend at the time, and we ended up in Geneva or Zurich. It was winter. And they were very welcoming with us, you know, and offering some help and some place to stay. And at the beginning, it was like, wow, I can't believe this. And they even give us some check with money to survive the first month. And after 2 or 3 days, we felt, this is not going to work. This is not really going to work. And so we came back to the office of you know, the people who were helping us, and we gave them back the check. And I remember the look of the lady, like thinking, these people are really crazy, you know, like they don't know what they are doing. So we flew back to Argentina. But I think it also has to be with the idea of time, you know, when we felt like, I mean, I don't want to be disrespectful at all with Swiss society, because then, of course, it's sort of cliche, and then I discovered that it was far much more complex to what I thought. But yeah, it was true that the first impression coming from South America, and coming specifically from Buenos Aires in time of crisis, it was like, oh my God, this is, I'm here just to die, you know, and then we had to escape from there.
Like a weird and eerie stillness in everything.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was like a long night, you know, coming at 3 p.m. and
yeah. That's interesting, and specifically to give back money, like to refuse money.
Yes.
That would be so unlogical in Switzerland because everything is money-based, which can be good also when it comes to like things like healthcare or so let's not talk about the cliches, as you said. But you're right. It's interesting that also the feeling of time through this is totally different. Would you say, is there for artists in the city where you work and where you come from, is there through this very specific feeling of time and improvisation, is there also something like a different form of vulnerability in the arts, so that you see something like, for instance, like to be blown away and even to deal with the end of your life? Is that more present?
Well, I think yes, probably it is. Probably depends on which generation also. I'm coming from a generation that we are mostly, I mean, we experienced during our childhood the dictatorship in Argentina. You know, we have this terrible military dictatorship until '85. So my childhood was with that, and my parents were left-wing militants, so we were hiding during those times, and many members of my family were killed during the time, and most people that a lot of friends of my parents and relatives suffered the same. So yeah, it was not just a theoretical feeling, you know, or a inner perception that everything can be really wrong or being blown away suddenly, but a sort of reality. And since then, we kept on having this economic and social crisis where people are really getting expelled from the system systematically. And yeah, so I think in the art fields it's extremely present, the idea of vulnerability and that things might radically change, usually for the worst, at every minute. It's true that gives us a feeling of, well, we need to do a lot of things fast, and we need to create links together, and the nets that we create are really strong, and there is usually a huge collaborations. Although sometimes I feel that I have to remind myself, you know, that living in constant crisis is not good for creativity, you know, because sometimes it exists this romanticization that well, you have crisis and everything, and that's good for the art because it takes you, and it's really not.
That would be cheap to say.
Yeah,
that's what.
Yeah.
Most of all times, like very privileged people can say, it's good for you to have problems because otherwise, that's of course ridiculous. But I thought about a different and deeper form of vulnerability, which can be good for the arts. Not like only political crisis, but like, yeah. So, what do you see and hear when you tour? For instance, you tour through Europe. What's different? Can you say it like, because I feel there's a huge difference between Italy, England, France, Germany, even Austria, Switzerland. Do you see that too when you tour?
Well, I must say that in a way I do. I notice how different audiences are, and how much their reactions are affecting the pieces or not. But then in a more deep level, it's much more difficult for me to say what, I mean, sometimes I have the privilege to work with local artists together, either performers or making collaborations with local artists, and then I have the chance to get more deep in this difference. But yeah, it was always, it's very interesting your question, because indeed I always feel that it's very different in each place, and the reaction, and of course the links that you might create with the piece itself. Also because it's true that the information that people might have about Argentina or something specific that is inside the piece is different in Germany than in Spain, for example. But it's very difficult for me to elaborate, you know, in which way they are different.
But it's inspiring for you.
Very much.
So you tour around and you think you get a lot of energy back from what you invest in your art.
Very much. Also because, you know, the art scene in Buenos Aires, probably in every city, but also especially in Buenos Aires because we are quite far away from other big cities, it's a sort of a bit endogamic, and we end up having always the same audience, and so the feedback and the impact that you might also create, it's a bit limited. And while touring, we feel how much the show is evolving and how much it creates new relationships with audiences because of different moments. I remember our previous piece to this one. It was one piece related to the Russian Revolution, and we were talking a lot about revolution and independence, and it has certain meaning in different places. And then we went to Spain, to Catalonia, right at the time when all the debate about independence were there, and that completely changed the perception of the people about the piece, and also creates certain interesting tension inside the piece. So that was very, very interesting.
So, I wish you thousands of wonderful pieces of work and tours and everything, and health and inspiration. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you
Mariano.
for your support, and thank you so much.
Thank you.